Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you for what I know is going to be a very special program. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm a former chancellor of the university, a former dean of this law school, and I currently have the privilege of serving as chair of Pitt's Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornburg Forum for Law and Public Policy. I welcome you first on behalf of those two organizations today. I also want to acknowledge and welcome you on behalf of Ginny Thornburg, the former First Lady of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Samantha Balbier, who is the director of the Institute of Politics. Dick Thornburg, who graduated from this law school, had an absolutely extraordinary career, including on the domestic side, service as United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. We have one of his proteges, Fred Tiemann, with us today, who also served in that role. Assistant United States Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division, two-term governor of Pennsylvania, and United States Attorney General under both George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan. Dick also served as Undersecretary General of the United Nations and had a deep, deep interest in the world order. In fact, I can recall sitting in this courtroom, it's probably decades ago, listening to a presentation by Dick on the Federal Foreign Corrupt Acts law at a program that was hosted by the Center for International Legal Education and by Professor Ron Brand. This program is a part of our Preserving Democracy series. Perhaps the most basic right we have as citizens in a democracy is the right to vote. I hope that everyone in this room already has registered. You've got a little less than 2 weeks to do that, and if you haven't, Pitt Votes people will be at a table outside the room when the program ends to help you with that process. Let me thank our co-sponsors, Pitt Law, Pitt Cyber, and the David Frederick Honors College. The Thornburg Forum and the Institute of Politics are particularly grateful to the Center for International Legal Education and its founding director, Professor Ron Brand, for the contributions that they have made in arranging for and participating in this program. The program today focuses on an issue that probably has not gotten as much attention as many others in the lead up to the election, but it is a very important issue. America does have a place in the world, and the two major party candidates have very different perspectives on this issue. Guiding us in our thinking today is Jeff Kovar from the State Department, who, given his experiences, probably is the perfect speaker. He's perfect in another way, too. Jeff was born in Pittsburgh, just down the street in McGee Hospital, though he was transplanted to the eastern part of the state as a boy. The western Pennsylvania roots of his mother go back to the 1700s, and she trained as a nurse at what then was Presbyterian University Hospital. Not only did his father earned both his undergraduate degree and his medical degree from Pitt, but so did uncles, and even more recently, one of his sons graduated from Pitt in 2000, and I'm pleased to say that Jeff reports he had a great experience here. Somehow Jeff got away from us. I haven't had the courage to ask him whether he just couldn't get in, but he went to Williams College and the University of Michigan School of Law. Then after clerking for 1 year with a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, he accepted a position at the State Department, and he has been there for the past 38 years. As a non-political appointee, he has served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, and he has held so many important and interesting positions that it took almost all of a 2-hour dinner last night for us to get through them. So I'll spare you that complete history today and say instead that he currently is Assistant Legal Advisor for Political and Military Affairs in the State Department. The office that he leads provides guidance on wide-ranging matters, including international humanitarian law, the use of force, counterterrorism, cyber operations, military cooperation and basing agreements, sensitive military operations, and arms export controls. We are very fortunate that he has come and agreed to share his thoughts on these big and important topics today. And I should emphasize that the thoughts that he will be sharing are his own. He is not here to speak on behalf of the State Department or of the federal government more generally. Jeff and Professor Ron Brand met, appropriately enough, when they were part of a State Department delegation negotiating an international treaty at the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Ron is the founding director of the Center for International Legal Education, as well as its Master of Laws program for foreign law students and its Doctor of Juridical Science program. Though I had absolutely nothing to do with the selection process, I'm pleased to say that Ron was honored with the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award and the Chancellor's Distinguished Public Service Award when I was Chancellor. And I'm also very proud of the fact that he currently holds the university professorship that bears my name. After Jeff has completed an initial presentation, Ron will come up and join him at the front of the courtroom. I presume to ask a few questions of his own, and then also to be the principal director of traffic for questions from the audience. Again, it's great to be here with you today. Please join me in giving a warm Pitt and Pittsburgh welcome to Jeff Kovar.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chancellor Emeritus. Thanks also to Mrs. Thornburg and to the Institute and to the Center at Pitt Law. And I'm really grateful to have been invited and looking forward to the talk. Just to underline what Chancellor Nordenberg just said, which is that I'm here to speak in my own behalf and not necessarily with the views of the Department of State or the U.S. government. So I've been asked to address the importance of alliances in U.S. foreign policy, specifically the NATO alliance, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. Some alliances are remembered for having failed. You may remember from history books the transient and shifting European alliances such as the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, leading up to World War I. Well, the NATO alliance is different. It's not only endured for 75 years, it's evolved and grown as it's successfully adapted to meet its goals of maintaining transatlantic security against external threats and facilitating the political integration and the stability of Europe. And NATO is not alone. It is only one part of a vast and extensive worldwide network of allies and partners of the United States. So this presentation will be in three parts. First, I want to sketch for you the remarkable history of NATO and how it has evolved and grown in response to the changing political and security challenges facing it. Second, we'll take a quick look under the hood of this operation and try to get a sense of how it's constructed and how it really works, and what the issues are at the forefront of NATO today. And third, we'll look briefly at how the United States also uses other regional and bilateral alliances to create political and security networks to protect friends and partners, coordinate with foreign militaries, counter terrorism, and ultimately better secure our homeland. So let's start with NATO. In the aftermath of World War II, the cities of Europe were in rubble, national economies were devastated, and the Soviet Union was actively assisting communist parties throughout the continent to overthrow democratic governments. In 1948, the elected government of Czechoslovakia was overthrown in a coup, and the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in an effort to drive out the American and British occupation forces. In that context, 12 countries from Europe and North America came together to form a transatlantic security alliance. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, like most formal alliances, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, started with a treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed in Washington on April 4th, 1949. The NATO treaty is best known for the security guarantee that's at its core. In Article 5, the parties agreed that an armed attack against any one of them would be considered an attack on all of them. Each party agreed to assist the party attacked through such action as it deemed necessary, including potentially the use of armed force, to restore and maintain security of the North Atlantic area. There's two issues to flag here. First, Article 5 does not require every ally to support the ally that was attacked with military force. It leaves the type of support to their discretion. And second, the North Atlantic area defended by the Article 5 security guarantee is limited in Article 6 to the parties' territories in Europe and North America, their islands north of the Tropic of Cancer, which is just above Cuba, and their forces, vessels, and aircraft operating in the Mediterranean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean north of the Tropic of Cancer. While the Article 5 guarantee is fundamental to the alliance, the NATO treaty, although it's very short, there's only 14 articles, so about 1,000 or 1,200 words, the treaty contains much more. In Articles 1 and 2, the parties pledged to settle disputes peacefully, to uphold the principles of the UN Charter, which include by refraining from the threat or use of force except in self-defense, to strengthen their free institutions of government and encourage economic collaboration and well-being. In Article 3, they pledged to maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. In Article 4, they committed to consult together whenever any one of them feels that their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. And in Article 9, they created a council to implement the alliance, and they authorized the council to set up subsidiary bodies. Finally, in Article 10, the parties agreed that they may invite by unanimous agreement any other European state that's in a position to further the principles of this treaty and contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area to accede to the treaty. So in those brief provisions, the NATO treaty created the essential legal framework for the strong and enduring alliance that it has become. But it took the atomic bomb to push the alliance to the next stage. As described by NATO itself, while signing of the North Atlantic Treaty had created allies, it had not created a military structure that could effectively coordinate their actions. This changed when growing worries about Soviet intentions culminated in the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb in 1949, and then in the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The effect upon the alliance was dramatic. So the NATO parties through the Council acted quickly to establish a consolidated command structure with a military headquarters called the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE. Members of the alliance realized that a military command structure was necessary to ensure greater integration of NATO forces and proper lines of command in the event of a crisis or war. The first Supreme Commander was General Eisenhower. Soon after the creation of SHAPE, the Council also created a civilian secretariat led by a Secretary General. By 1951, the Allies had concluded an agreement on the status of forces, what we know in the business as a SOFA agreement, which provided the legal basis for the armed forces and other civilian contractors, civilian dependents of one ally to be sent by arrangement to serve in the territory of any of the other allies. The SOFA addresses legal issues such as entry and exit, tax waivers, postal services, employment, civil and criminal jurisdiction. Now, these issues may sound trivial, but they're in fact the important and practical legal machinery that allows Allied military forces to efficiently deploy, transit through, equip, and station everywhere in the alliance. This efficiency was dramatically displayed following the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when U.S. and Allied forces rapidly deployed into the NATO eastern and southeastern flanks, from Estonia in the north to Bulgaria in the south. So by 1952, NATO began expanding. First, with Greece and Turkey acceding to the treaty, which extended the alliance eastward into the Mediterranean, and then West Germany in 1955. Soon the Soviet Union had established its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, to oppose NATO. And in 1961, they built the Berlin Wall to keep East Germans from defecting to the West. Now, this was the height of the Cold War, and nuclear massive retaliation was the core strategic doctrine of NATO. NATO's main focus was on defending Europe from Soviet conventional and nuclear attack. But political détente began slowly to reshape East-West relations in the 60s and by the 70s, and NATO gradually began to adopt a more flexible response strategy to security threats from the Warsaw Pact. This involved enhancing NATO's conventional defenses and formulating plans for military responses short of a full nuclear exchange. At the same time, NATO began expanding its activities to include scientific research and promoting other forms of political dialogue between NATO and Warsaw Pact countries. One of the outcomes of this new focus was the convening of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, what was called the CSCE in 1973, which led to the negotiation and adoption of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. We're now approaching its 50th anniversary. The Helsinki Final Act committed its signatories, which included NATO members and the Soviet Union and members of the Warsaw Pact, to respect the fundamental freedoms of their citizens, including the freedoms of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, while also insisting on basic principles of international law and conduct, including the right to be or not to be the party to treaties of alliance. The principles of the Helsinki Final Act later would play a key role in the successful struggle to overthrow communist governments in Eastern Europe. Ultimately, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the Soviet stationing of a new class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe ended détente, and it led to NATO responding with the decision to deploy American nuclear-capable intermediate-range missiles and cruise missiles, which, for those of you who remember, was politically very divisive in Europe at the time. The Cold War was refreezing. But by 1987, the ascent of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and his glasnost policy and the reinvigoration of arms control negotiations helped lead to the conclusion of the INF Treaty, which banned intermediate nuclear weapons, missiles in Europe. And by the end of the decade, suddenly everything had changed. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989, and a fully sovereign, reunited Germany came into being in 1990. The incorporation of a reunified Germany into the alliance calmed historic Western fears of a united Germany's potential impact on European security and stability, and it helped set the stage for economic and political integration to quickly accelerate in Europe, eventually leading to the European Union. So the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union had disappeared, but NATO remained. Critically, beginning around this time, NATO allies worked together and with the Soviet Union and then with Russia and the USSR's successor states to secure via arms control some of the gains from the end of the Cold War. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty transformed conventional forces in Europe with the dramatic reduction in heavy armor. And at the CSCE by the mid-90s, called the OSCE, there was a rich discussion between NATO allies and partners, which also yielded a harvest of military confidence and security building measures. And as the Warsaw Pact collapsed, NATO also reached out to its Central European, Eastern European, and Central Asian neighbors. In 1991, NATO established the North Atlantic Cooperation Council to bring the allies together on a regular basis and consult with these newly liberated countries. NATO allies and their neighboring countries saw cooperation with NATO as fundamental to those countries' aspirations for stability, democracy, and European integration. Cooperation also extended southward. In 1994, the alliance founded the Mediterranean Dialogue with 6 non-member states. But at the same time, Yugoslavia was breaking apart with ethnic violence, and a devastating civil war began in the heart of Europe. The Yugoslav wars led to NATO's first direct participation in military operations. Initially, NATO did not get involved militarily in the conflict, but as ethnic cleansing and atrocities mounted, NATO offered military support to end the atrocities in line with UN Security Council decisions. NATO offered to support UN efforts to end war crimes, imposing a naval embargo, a no-fly zone, and then taking airstrikes against heavy weapons. Ultimately, the alliance carried out a 9-day air campaign in September 1995 against Serb forces that had been involved in the Srebrenica massacre, which played a major role in ending the conflict. NATO also then played a role in the political resolution of the armed conflict in the former Yugoslavia. With the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords at the end of 1995, NATO deployed a UN-mandated multinational force of 60,000 soldiers to help implement the agreement and to create the conditions for a self-sustaining peace. In 2004, NATO turned this role over to the European Union. And as the war in the former Yugoslavia raged and other conflicts in the Caucasus were unfolding in parts of the former Soviet Union, NATO created a new mechanism in 1994 to allow non-NATO countries to cooperate with the alliance and reform their still evolving democratic and military institutions. This was called the Partnership for Peace program. The Partnership for Peace assisted these non-NATO partners in modernizing their militaries in line with modern democratic standards and opened a path to full membership for those who wished to pursue it. In 1999, 3 states of the former Warsaw Pact, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, became full members of the alliance. Also, at that time, NATO made intensive efforts to end the inter-ethnic war in Kosovo that included Serb atrocities against ethnic Albanian Kosovars. When efforts to get the Yugoslav government to agree to a NATO peacekeeping force failed, NATO began an intensive bombing campaign involving forces from nearly every member of the alliance. Finally, with Yugoslav government consent, NATO forces entered in a peacekeeping role, which it still performs today. NATO summed up this period as follows. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO had been a static organization whose mere existence was enough to deter the Soviet Union. Balkan intervention began the alliance's transformation into a more dynamic and responsive organization. Gone was the Cold War doctrine of nuclear retaliation, and in its place, the determination to use, after all peaceful means had failed, measured and carefully applied force in combination with diplomatic and humanitarian efforts to stop conflict, and to do so, if necessary, out of NATO's traditional North Atlantic sphere. NATO adopted a new strategic concept, announcing that the world was now facing complex new risks to Euro-Atlantic peace and security, including oppression, ethnic conflict, economic distress, the collapse of political order, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and said that the alliance had to be prepared to address them. On 9/11, it would have to. Following al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the United States, NATO members met and invoked its Collective Defense Clause, Article 5, for the first and so far only time in NATO's history. Invocation of Article 5 following these terrorist strikes was not automatic, and the NATO Secretary General at the time, Lord Robertson, spent most of the day following 9/11 making the case to NATO members. He said of this time, "I insisted that Article 5 was relevant and was the ultimate act of solidarity with the people of the United States. What had the self-defense clause meant if it was not valid at this dramatic moment of aggression?" Many NATO countries joined the military coalition under Operation Enduring Freedom that drove al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan and toppled the Taliban regime in Kabul. The UN Security Council authorized the deployment in Kabul of an international security assistance force, which was called ISAF, in 2001, to help stabilize the country and create the conditions for a self-sustaining peace. And some NATO members took part in that. And then in August 2003, NATO took over command and coordination of ISAF, broadening its area of control from Kabul alone to the whole country by 2006, and operating until the end of the mission in 2014. NATO forces also engaged in other operations outside the North Atlantic Treaty Area. In 2004, NATO formed the NATO training mission Iraq to assist in the development of Iraqi security forces, training structures, and institutions, so the Iraqi interim government could build an effective and sustainable defense capability. In 2009, NATO deployed warships in a counter-piracy operation to protect maritime traffic in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean from Somali pirates, and helped strengthen the navies and coast guards of regional states to resist those pirates. NATO forces played a significant role in Libya when civil war engulfed that country, and the UN Security Council authorized military action to protect civilians. NATO forces enforced a UN arms embargo and a no-fly zone, including monitoring, reporting, and interdicting vessels suspected of carrying illegal arms or mercenaries, and targeting ground forces with airstrikes. The war in Syria also has engaged NATO. Turkey invoked Article 4, the Consultations Clause, 4 times between 2012 and 2020 as fighting in Syria spilled over its borders. As a result, NATO established a border protection operation for Turkey with the deployment of significant air defense capabilities that are still there. Meanwhile, throughout this time and up until today, NATO has continued to accept new members and to build new partnerships. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined in 2004, Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020, Finland in 2023, and most recently Sweden in 2024. And NATO did not forget its former enemy. Starting in 1997 and in 2002, partnership arrangements were also created with Russia and with Ukraine. As it happens, the relationship with Ukraine has flourished, but the relationship with Russia has not. Since 2016, NATO has also increasingly engaged politically with its partners in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand, to discuss the shift in the global balance of power in Asia, with the rise of China. NATO is also intensifying dialogue and cooperation with Colombia in Latin America. Now, these global partners have access to the full range of activity that NATO offers to all its partners. They work with NATO on a range of common cross-cutting security challenges, including cyber defense, counterterrorism, and nonproliferation. Some partners participate in NATO's military operations, while many have benefited from NATO's expertise in areas such as building defense capacity, defense training, and education. NATO also consults with other non-member countries, such as China, Brazil, Ghana, India, and Singapore, in particular on regional security dynamics. Now, Russia's invasion and occupation of Crimea and its aggression in eastern Ukraine starting in 2014, and then its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, has brought NATO full circle to a renewed focus on the threat that Russia poses to peace in Europe. And NATO has responded with unprecedented political and military support for Ukraine's efforts to defend its territory from Russian aggression. Following Russia's illegal seizure of Crimea in 2014, NATO helped to reform Ukraine's armed forces and defense institutions, including with equipment and financing. Allies have also provided training for tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, and Ukrainian forces have developed and modernized their capabilities by participating in NATO exercises and operations. Since 2016, NATO's support to Ukraine has been organized through a wide range of capacity-building programs and trust funds, focusing on key areas like cyber defense, logistics, and countering hybrid warfare. These programs have enabled Ukraine to provide for its own security and to implement wide-ranging reforms based on NATO standards, Euro-Atlantic principles, and best practices. However, since 2022, the NATO alliance has taken this partnership with Ukraine to a new level. First, in 2023, the alliance created the NATO-Ukraine Council as a decision-making body responsible for developing the NATO-Ukraine relationship and for directing cooperative activities. In the Council, for the first time, the NATO allies and Ukraine sit side by side as equals. Second, the allies established the NATO Security Assistance and Training Program to coordinate the immediate provision of military equipment and training and logistical support for Ukraine by NATO members. The program operates in allied states to support Ukraine's self-defense, consistent with the UN Charter, while enabling its further integration with NATO. Third, at the Washington Summit this year, Allied leaders announced a pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine for the provision of military equipment, assistance, and training to enable Ukraine to build a force capable of defeating Russia's aggression today and deterring it in the future. Now, Russia periodically claims that by providing this support for Ukraine's military operations, that NATO members are participating in the hostilities against Russia, that effectively we're at war with them, and has warned of retaliation, including by engaging in nuclear saber-rattling. In response, NATO and members such as the United States have stated publicly that provision of security assistance to Ukraine to support its self-defense against Russia's unlawful aggression is legal under international law and does not make NATO a party to the conflict with Russia. Now, NATO has also significantly increased its military presence along the eastern flank, as I mentioned before. This would deter any potential Russian moves toward NATO members. As of June 2022, in member countries from Estonia in the north to Bulgaria in the south, there were 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, 130 Allied aircraft on high alert, and 140 Allied ships at sea. The United States has nearly 100,000 troops in Europe. So how does NATO work? NATO is an international organization in which each member retains its full sovereignty. Consensus of all members is required for every decision. It's not a supranational body that tells us what to do. The North Atlantic Council, what we call the NAC, is the supreme deliberative body of NATO. It meets weekly at the level of ambassadors in Brussels, and then several times a year at the defense minister, at the foreign minister, and at the head of state levels. Now, the meeting room for the NAC has inscribed on the wall NATO's motto, which in Latin is Animus inconsulendo liber, which apparently translates to a free mind in council. This statement was attributed to Cato the Younger when addressing the Roman Senate, and the quote is intended to convey the conviction that all decisions of the alliance must be made by all the allies together and represent the sovereign will of each one. It also captures the consultation ethos that's at the heart of the alliance. Now, a key figure in the alliance is the Secretary General. As chair of the NAC, the Secretary General is responsible for advancing the program of work, guiding discussion, facilitating decision-making, and overseeing implementation. The Secretary General is also the principal spokesperson for NATO, and as head of the international staff, the Secretary General is responsible for staff appointments and overseeing the work. After 10 years at the helm, the Norwegian Jens Stoltenberg is stepping down this month and will be replaced by Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, both former prime ministers. Now, subordinate to the NAC is a wide-ranging political and military infrastructure of committees and planning groups. The most important is the Military Committee, which is the highest purely military authority. The Military Committee has sections representing planning, training, operations, intelligence, support, communications, and so on, and it's supported by an international staff. There are two strategic military commands that are the operational military heart of the alliance. First is the Supreme Allied Command Operations, the ACO, which is based at SHAPE in Mons, Belgium, and it includes subsidiary commands that are in Italy, the Netherlands, and Portugal. The ACO is NATO's headquarters for all military planning operations for ground, naval, and air forces. Second is the Supreme Allied Command Transformation, which is based in Norfolk, Virginia, with subsidiary commands in Norway, Poland, Italy, and Portugal. The Supreme Allied Command Transformation promotes and oversees the continuing transformation of alliance forces and capabilities through training and development of new concepts and doctrine, and by supporting research and development and acquisition of new technologies. Today, NATO is facing issues not all envisioned in 1949. Hybrid threats, terrorism, cybersecurity and defense, the rise of a militarily and economically powerful China, emerging technology such as AI and hypersonic weapons, nuclear saber rattling, climate and energy challenges, and critical infrastructure protection. The world is still becoming less and less stable as a result of these changing threats. And this is why, in my view, NATO is more relevant today than ever. So let me briefly discuss two of these new threats. First is what you sometimes hear as state and non-state actors using what NATO calls hybrid activities to target political institutions, influence public opinion, and undermine the security of NATO citizens. Adversaries have long used methods like propaganda, deception, and sabotage to undermine each other during war. But what is new about attacks seen in recent years is how their speed, scale, penetration, and intensity are amplified by modern communications interconnectivity. NATO has developed strategies for countering this hybrid warfare and defending allies against hybrid threats. Second, cyber defense is now a core part of NATO's strategic planning and is considered a domain of operations, of military operations. Cyber threats to the security of the alliance and allies are complex, they're destructive and coercive, and they're becoming more and more frequent. Cyberspace is contested by state and non-state actors at all times, and malicious cyber events occur every day, from low-level to technologically sophisticated attacks. NATO is responding by strengthening the allies' ability to detect, prevent, and respond to malicious cyber activities. The alliance also recognizes that it has to be prepared to defend its networks and operations against the growing sophistication of cyber threats, and it's prepared to carry out its own operations and missions in cyberspace during armed conflict. Now, as important as NATO is, it's not America's only alliance. We have regional and bilateral collective defense arrangements with nearly 60 countries on every continent. These generally involve security and defense commitments of some kind, such as the mutual defense treaties we have with Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the Philippines, for example. The United States has also over 100 treaties and arrangements with countries, providing the legal authorities, privileges and protections for our visiting troops and our foreign bases. We have status of forces agreements, defense cooperation agreements, and other agreements necessary to service these U.S. forces stationed abroad or on temporary duty for joint operations and exercises and training. And they form the backbone for a robust U.S. military presence around the world. Our longstanding alliances with South Korea and with Japan, where we have multiple bases accommodating naval, air, and ground forces, maintain peace on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia, and have provided a stable security foundation for Japan's and Korea's remarkable economic and cultural development after devastating wars. Our alliance with the Philippines is currently being tested by Chinese unlawful territorial claims in the South China Sea and recklessly aggressive maritime pressure. We also have very important military bases in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Djibouti, in Cuba, and in Diego Garcia. No other country has such an extensive and comprehensive network of alliances, military cooperation arrangements, and bases around the world. Now let me conclude by coming back to NATO. NATO is a remarkable organization, providing through its military and political structures ironclad security for the North Atlantic region, while regularly rethinking and reorienting its mission to address changing political and security threats. As NATO has described it, since its founding in 1949, the Transatlantic Alliance's flexibility, embedded in its original treaty, has allowed it to suit the different requirements of different times. In the 1950s, the alliance was a purely defensive organization. In the 1960s, NATO became a political instrument for détente. In the 1990s, the alliance was a tool for the stabilization of Eastern Europe and Central Asia through the incorporation of new partners and allies. By the first half of the 21st century, NATO faces an ever-growing number of new threats. As the foundation stone for transatlantic peace and freedom, NATO must be ready to meet these challenges, unquote. Now, for 75 years, NATO has been led politically and militarily by the United States, and for a good reason. It's also the cornerstone of our own national security. By mutually guaranteeing the collective security of our closest democratic partners in Europe and North America, forging links with countries in every region of the world, and standing firm against the greatest threats to our national security, the organization does what we could not do alone. I'm not in a position to predict the future, but NATO shows every sign of vitality, flexibility, and political resolve. In my view, we're lucky to have it. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Jeff, this on? People can hear me? Okay, Jeff, thank you for a wonderful review of the history and impact of NATO. I want to exercise the moderator's privilege at the start here to ask some questions myself. And I want to dig in a little bit where you ended up, and that was kind of expanding beyond NATO in your discussions. In June of this year, I happened to hear a talk by General Charles G. Brown, Jr., who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He talked as well about the importance of alliances and noted in particular, and I think the end of your talk brought this out, how our allies in Europe watch what we do with our alliances in Asia, and our allies in Asia watch what we do with our alliances in Europe. And that means that what happens in Ukraine is important to what's happening elsewhere, and the way we respond to that is important to the Philippines and Japan, for example. And General Brown, and I want to quote this because he focused on watching our allies, and he said, "We know how important allies and partners are. when the world gets complex. That's the value of the partnerships and relationships we have. I like to say you never want to cold call in a crisis, and you never want to burn bridges. Those struck me as words that kind of put it all together. Can you, in your work, can you give us some idea of the importance of warm calls in a crisis and the importance of not burning bridges in alliances?
Thanks, Ron. As I mentioned in 9/11, we were able to call our allies in NATO. And not only I talked about how NATO forces ended up in Afghanistan and so on, but before that, NATO members sent over reconnaissance aircraft to patrol the skies over the United States in those first few weeks when we were afraid there might be more planes coming. And they also provided other support in the United States. In a more recent example, since the October 7th war in Gaza, the Houthi rebels in Yemen have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea, and including attacking U.S. naval vessels and threatening our allies. We made a policy decision to try to put together a collection of our allies to stand up to them and exercise our right of self-defense. But in order to do that, we had to discuss first with our allies what the legal basis would be for us to use force against rebels in another country, in Yemen. And the political demand to do this came up, of course, as things always do, over Christmas, New Year holidays. But we, as the lawyers, were able to call up our friends and colleagues from NATO that we know well through our legal channels to have the kind of discussions that we needed to have so that everybody could be on the same page. So for those countries who ended up participating in the operation, was called Poseidon Arrow, to use military force to defend against the Houthi strikes, those conversations were essential.
With another question to go in a little bit different direction, as Mark indicated, you and I worked together on a different type of set of treaties at the Hague Conference on Private International Law, and you haven't spent all your time on political and military affairs, and were assistant legal advisor for private international law at that time. And for there is a treaty that may well go up to the Senate in this next year called the Hague Convention on Choice of Court Agreements that Jeff came into that office and I think saved after a very difficult set of negotiations. But it deals with disputes between private parties and the ability to know what court to go to, where to go with the judgment, and be able to recognize and enforce decisions from other states. That's a whole different area. But when we talk about alliances, is there an importance to rule of law, to the rules that deal with private parties as well as the rules that deal with armed intervention by states?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't call it, I mean, we've been talking about alliances in its sort of formal term, which is, security and defense alliances. And obviously when you're dealing with harmonizing rules of private law, you're not talking about that. But in order to get things accomplished, particularly in the private international law field, we would always start with our common law partners, countries that share the same legal foundations that we do, and then we would branch out to other developed countries with a civil law, sort of a Napoleonic Code type background, which often could be more difficult because they have different concepts and different approaches, and we'd have to spend a lot of time listening and going back and forth. But it was working with those two groups then that we could put together coalitions to try to get things done.
And I would note that the relationships that were formed at The Hague were relationships with partners that we dealt with in NATO and other places as well. Did you ever see some of the people from The Hague come into the kind of things you're dealing with now, and some of the, and I'm thinking also of the Russians and the people we dealt with there, and the fact that the relationships with justice ministries that are built in that kind of a setting, do they carry over into the political military arena?
I mean, many governments, I mean, I have a sort of unique career because I've done so many different things in the Department of State, the Office of Legal Advisor, and that's sort of characteristic of our office. It's not necessarily so characteristic in other countries. You don't often see people from the private law field in the political military field, but sometimes you do. And but the basic approach of getting to know your peers, getting to understand them as people, trying to understand where they're coming from, where their positions are formed, that's the only way you really can map out the compromises you need in order to reach common ground.
I imagine I'm not the only person with questions here, so let's open it up and take some questions from the audience.
So you mentioned that members of the former Soviet bloc have joined NATO. So there are some who argue that NATO's eastward expansion actually made Russia feel as though its sphere of influence was being threatened, and that triggered or at least contributed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that argument?
Well, I know some people argue that, but you know, NATO didn't reach out and suck up those countries. Those countries themselves decided that they needed to join NATO in order to maintain their own national defense and national security. So they felt that it was important to join NATO. And NATO, as I mentioned in the treaty, has always been open to any European state that's willing to join and commit to its principles.
So you've mentioned international law a few times throughout this presentation, and I was just curious, for your perspective, specifically as a lawyer, do you think, well, it's really twofold. So first of all, do you think that our selective adherence to international human rights law has hurt our reputation, our general standing with other NATO countries throughout the world? And then secondly, moving forward, as you kind of left us on that note of a forward-looking note, what role do you think international law does play in the US or NATO's strategy and policy moving forward? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with your premise that the U.S. regularly violates international human rights law. You know, in fact, we, compliance and implementation of international human rights law is a foundational part of U.S. foreign policy, and we pursue that in the Human Rights Council and around the world. Now, obviously, there's certain circumstances and situations where people don't always see eye to eye, and of course, we're not always perfect, but in principle and in practice, we do make every effort to comply with and to promote international human rights law.
I'd like to preface my question with saying I actually served in the armed forces for 8.5 years, and I finished my service in the Chief of Staff office working for K4 NATO. And so I want to ask the question, and I'm going to preface it with a little bit of history since you touched on it. On June 12, 1999, NATO led a peacekeeping force into the Kosovo region of the Balkans, dealing with the growing humanitarian crisis and claims of ethnic cleansing. The dispute was between Serbia and Albania, two non-NATO nations. When NATO went in, Russia gave a stark warning, saying that it was a dangerous precedent for NATO to put boots on ground in a conflict outside of its allies' borders. In response, NATO allowed Russian observers to be allowed to live on the base and ensure that NATO would not set up permanent operations. In the following years, these observers would be restricted and eventually kicked out of the country, even to the point of a standoff at the international airport between NATO and Russian troops. 10 years later, Kosovo would declare its independence. Now, 26 years later, KFOR is the highest NATO command in the Balkans region and oversees officially 5,000 soldiers in the region, a region that is still non-NATO member. How can we honestly critique Russia's actions in Ukraine or similar situations when America and NATO continue to meddle in other nations' business, especially when part of their repertoire, their techniques, is to cause regional instability and then use that to preposition direct involvement?
Well, Kosovo is a tremendously complex and interesting, has a history, and you've touched on some of it from one perspective, and I think the important thing to say is that NATO went into Kosovo after serious deliberation, and in order to stop atrocities. At that time it was still called Yugoslavia because it was Serbia and Montenegro, but the Yugoslav forces were out of control, and we had tried to get the Yugoslav forces to halt their deprivations and to allow peacekeeping forces. They wouldn't do it. So a political decision was made to use force. Now, there are arguments about whether there was an international law basis to use force, but that's what happened. And since then, it's NATO that's kept the peace. I don't think there's any comparison to what's going on in Ukraine, where Russia clearly has violated the UN Charter. It's invaded and occupied and committed atrocities in a sovereign country, and there's just no justification for that, no matter what they come up with. Probably should go to the next question.
I have a question. My question is using essentially unconventional warfare in these conflicts in an ever-changing landscape of alliances. I mean, for example, I was in a children's camp in the 80s and 90s during the Chernobyl Yugoslav war, changing landscapes, with preparation to be shipped to America with thousands of children being disconnected from our countries and our families. Permanently, records changed and shipped to America. And Pittsburgh is listed as number 9 or number 10 in child trafficking, human trafficking. So this is like using unconventional warfare, which is using children to carry these things out. Such as recently, Russia took, it's estimated 40,000 children from Ukrainian territories and force adopted them into Russia, while those children still have families. But their records were changed and they were just force adopted. Some here are using that method, and it's estimated that since Chernobyl, 72,000 children were essentially force adopted into America using those methods. And Russia is doing those similar methods right now. So what's the legal basis for using this?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I don't know whether you meant to suggest that you yourself were a victim of child trafficking. I can't comment on that. I don't know the facts, but it would be terrible if you were. But Russia's actions, where they've been abducting Ukrainian children, taking them to Russia and adopting them and so on, that's been the subject of an indictment by the International Criminal Court.
This is the same question on two different scales, but can you just expand on the role of lawyers at the State Department? Lawyers at the State Department, and then also just share your thoughts on the role of America, that the spheres that Americans' foreign policy agenda rests in the hands of nonpartisan, non-elected lawyers. What do they actually control?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things you'll learn when you practice law is that somebody else makes the policy decisions and the business decisions, and the lawyers we're service people. We provide counsel, and so sometimes the people who are making the decisions listen to our counsel, and sometimes they don't. But on a day-to-day basis, we try to help them understand the legal framework surrounding the policy goals that they have, and if it's lawful, to help them structure what they want to do in such a way that it supports and affirms legal issues. So, for example, if the United States, and you'll read it in the news from time to time, the United States has, recently taken strikes in Iraq against Iranian-aligned militia groups that have been attacking our forces in Iraq. And before we do that, we actually have an interagency lawyers group involving the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the National Security Council, where we look to see what the proposals are and whether there's a domestic law basis under U.S. law and whether there's an international law basis for those strikes.
I think we should thank both Jeff and Ron again for a terrific program. Let me say on another program note, there is a special pair of programs coming up in 2 days. October the 10th will feature Professor Ilana Redstone from the University of Illinois, who is the author of the book, The Certainty Trap. The first program is a part of the Institute of Politics, Elsie Hillman Civic Forum's All Angles program, which is designed to expose students to differing points of view and to provide some kind of a counterweight to polarization. In this particular case, that part of the program is limited to students. In this particular case, there also will be a session open to students or to faculty, staff, and members of the community. That will be at 5 o'clock, but that's October 10th in the William Pitt Union's Lower Lounge, and there are flyers for that program outside the door. Also in that direction, again, are people who can help you to register to vote if you haven't already done so. Again, thanks for being here, and thanks to, Ron, did you want to say something?
I'm going to take my chance to get in a plug for a program that's coming in as well. On October 18, a week from Friday, we're going to have the 32nd annual McLean Lecture on World Law. We've had a great group of people come in for the first 31, including Dick Thornburg. But we're going to have Markian Kluchkovsky, a 2006 graduate of Pitt Law, LLM graduate, who is now the executive director of the Register for Damages Against Ukraine, an organization the U.S. government has supported in The Hague that is gathering evidence on claims by individuals and others against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And it's a chance to kind of take a next step in the look at this process that has happened in Ukraine and see where it might be going under concepts of rule of law and opportunities for lawyers of the future as well. So noon here on October 18 in the same room. Thanks.
Thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Jeff and Ron.